In 1984, a 3-year-old girl was found alive inside a house where her entire family had been brutally attacked. Her father was dead. Her mother was dead. Her 7-year-old sister was dead. But the killer was gone. For 37 years, investigators had no name, no confession, no arrest. Only a terrifying crime scene, and a family that had been destroyed in the place where they were supposed to be safest. Then, in 2018, the case suddenly moved. DNA from the murder scene finally produced a match, and the name investigators received shocked everyone, because the man they were looking for was not a mysterious stranger who had disappeared into the darkness. He was already in prison. He had been there for years. The killer had not escaped justice. He had been sitting inside the system while the Bennett family waited nearly 4 decades for answers. And when investigators finally discovered who he was, they realized something even more disturbing. The man linked to the murders had a violent history that stretched far beyond the Bennett home. But how had nobody connected him to the family massacre? And what exactly happened inside the Bennett house on the night a birthday celebration turned into one of Colorado's most horrifying unsolved murder cases? The answer began on a cold January night in 1984, 2 days before Melissa Bennett's 8th birthday. Her family had gathered together. There was food on the table, voices in the house, the ordinary noise of people who believed they would wake up the next morning and continue their lives. Bruce Bennett was 27 years old. His wife, Debra, was 26. Their daughter, Melissa, was 7, and 3-year-old Vanessa was the youngest child. That night, family members came and went. They laughed. They talked. They celebrated Melissa. And then, eventually, the house became quiet. The last relatives left. The children went to sleep. But one detail remained. The garage door was open. Someone noticed it. Bruce was reminded to close it. But the door stayed open. And sometime after the family had gone to bed, someone used that open door to enter the Bennett home. The killer did not need to break a window, did not need to force a door. He simply walked into the house. And inside were 2 sleeping children, their parents, and a family that had no idea that the final night of their lives had already begun. By the time morning came, 3 members of the Bennett family would be dead, and the only survivor would be a 3-year-old girl. But what investigators found inside the house would raise a question that would remain unanswered for decades. Why did the killer attack the entire family? The answer would begin with a phone call. A call that should have been ordinary, but by the time it ended, the Bennett family would be gone. The morning after the birthday gathering, Bruce and Debra did not show up for work. At first, their absence may not have seemed like an emergency. People get sick. Cars break down. Plans change. But as the hours passed, concern began to grow. Bruce and Debra were not the kind of people who simply disappeared without explanation. And the house was silent. No one answered the phone. No one opened the door. No one came outside. Then, a family member went to check on them. And when they arrived at the Bennett home, something immediately felt wrong. The garage door was still open. The same garage door that had been left open the night before. The same opening that may have allowed a stranger to enter the home without breaking in. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. There was no sound of Bruce. No sound of Debra. No sound of the children. And then the family member discovered the first body. Bruce Bennett was dead. He had suffered horrific injuries. The kind of injuries that immediately told investigators this was not an accident. This was murder. But Bruce was not the only victim. Debra was also dead. And then investigators found 7-year-old Melissa, the little girl whose birthday had been just 2 days away. The child whose family had gathered to celebrate her. She would never see that birthday. And then came the discovery that made the entire case even more horrifying. 3-year-old Vanessa was still alive. Somehow, amid the violence, the blood, and the destruction, the youngest child had survived. She had suffered serious injuries, but she was breathing. And suddenly, investigators were not simply looking at a triple homicide. They were looking at a family massacre with one tiny survivor. A child who was too young to explain what had happened. Too young to tell police who had entered the house. Too young to describe the face of the person who had attacked her family. The house became a crime scene. Investigators moved carefully through the rooms. Every object mattered. Every footprint mattered. Every drop of blood mattered. Because somewhere inside that house was the answer. Somewhere was the person who had walked into the Bennett home in the middle of the night. But the scene offered no simple explanation. There was no obvious connection between the family and their killer. No note. No confession. No clear motive. Instead, investigators were left with a terrifying possibility. The killer may not have come to the Bennett home because of Bruce, or Debra, or Melissa. He may have come because the house was there, and the family happened to be inside. That possibility changed everything. Because if the murders were personal, investigators could search for someone with a grudge, someone angry at Bruce, someone connected to Debra, someone who had threatened the family. But if the killer was a stranger, then almost anyone could be responsible. And somewhere outside the house, the killer was already gone. But he had not left empty-handed. Investigators discovered that a purse had been taken from the home. Its contents were found scattered in the snow. And there were tracks. Tracks leading away from the house. A trail disappearing into the winter landscape. For a moment, it seemed as if the killer had left investigators a path to follow. But the trail did not lead to a name. It led into the unknown. And the question became even more terrifying. Had the killer planned the attack? Or had the violence begun with a simple break-in that spiraled completely out of control? In the days after the murders, the Bennett family home became a place of unanswered questions. Detectives retraced the family's final hours. They spoke with relatives. They examined the house. They searched for anyone who might have had a reason to hurt them. But the more investigators looked, the more confusing the case became. There was no obvious motive, no clear suspect, and no one who seemed to fit the crime. The family had been together only hours earlier. They had celebrated Melissa. They had eaten together. They had laughed together. And then, sometime during the night, everything changed. The exact sequence of events inside the home remained uncertain, but the violence was undeniable. The killer had attacked Bruce, then Debra, then Melissa, and somehow 3-year-old Vanessa survived. The scene raised a question that investigators could not escape. Was Vanessa intentionally spared, or had the killer simply believed the child was dead? For decades, no one could know for certain. And because Vanessa was so young, she could not provide the kind of eyewitness account investigators desperately needed. The most important witness in the case was also the least capable of explaining what she had seen. And that meant the crime scene itself had to speak. Investigators looked for fingerprints. They looked for blood. They looked for fibers. They looked for anything that might identify the person responsible. But in 1984, Forensic science had limitations. Evidence that might later become valuable could not always be tested. And DNA profiling, as investigators know it today, did not yet exist. The killer may have left biological evidence behind. But at the time, that evidence could not immediately reveal who he was. The case began to grow cold. And while investigators continued looking, the killer continued living. Somewhere, a man knew what had happened inside the Bennett home. He knew how Bruce died. He knew how Debra died. He knew what happened to Melissa. And he knew that a 3-year-old girl had survived. But he said nothing. Years passed. Then decades. The little girl grew up. The world changed around her. The investigators who had first worked the case grew older. Some eventually retired. Some died. But the case remained. 3 murders, 1 survivor, and an unknown killer. Then investigators began to notice something disturbing. The Bennett murders may not have been an isolated act of violence. Because around the same period, other brutal attacks had taken place in the Denver area. And some of them shared disturbing similarities. Homes, nighttime intrusions, violence, and a weapon that appeared again and again. A hammer. The possibility began to emerge that the Bennett family might not have been the only victims of the person responsible. But if one man was connected to multiple violent crimes, why had no one caught him? And more importantly, how many other crimes had he committed before the Bennett family ever knew his name? For years, investigators had only fragments. A crime scene, a weapon, a trail of evidence, and a biological profile that had no name attached to it. But as technology advanced, old evidence began to acquire new value. The evidence that had once been silent could now be tested. The case was no longer limited to what investigators in 1984 could see. Modern forensic science could examine the past. And somewhere in the evidence collected decades earlier, there was something that could potentially connect the killer to the crime. DNA. A microscopic trace. Something invisible to the naked eye. Something the killer could not have known would one day identify him. But there was still a problem. Even if investigators had a DNA profile, a profile alone was not a person. It was only a biological signature. A ghost without a name. And for years, the profile sat without a match. No suspect, no arrest, no breakthrough. The Bennett family had been murdered. The evidence existed, but the person responsible remained unidentified. Then, another violent crime took place. And this time, investigators had a suspect. A man named Alex Christopher Ewing. Ewing had been convicted of a violent attack in Nevada and was serving a prison sentence. At first, there was no obvious reason to connect him to the Bennett murders. He was not a member of the family. He was not someone investigators had originally identified as a suspect. And for decades, the Bennett case had remained separate from his known criminal history. But then came the DNA. Investigators obtained a sample connected to Ewing, and the results changed the case forever. The profile connected him to evidence from the Bennett crime scene. After 37 years, the unknown killer finally had a name. Alex Ewing. The man who had been a mystery since 1984 was no longer a mystery. And the most shocking part was not simply that investigators had finally identified him. It was where he was. He was already in prison. The man they had spent decades searching for had not been living under an assumed name in some distant country. He had not vanished into the wilderness. He had not disappeared completely. He had been inside the prison system. And the question that immediately followed was devastating. If the killer had already been in custody, how many years had the Bennett family spent waiting for justice while the answer was already behind bars? When the case finally reached court, nearly 4 decades had passed since the murders. The world had changed. The people who had first investigated the case were no longer the same young detectives who had walked through the Bennett home in 1984. The evidence was old. The memories were old. But the murders were still real. And now the prosecution had to prove that the DNA evidence did not simply place Ewing somewhere near the crime. It had to connect him to the murders, to the house, to the family, to the night that had destroyed the Bennett lives. The defense challenged the state's case. The passage of time became important. The handling of evidence was examined. The prosecution's interpretation of the DNA evidence was challenged. And after 37 years, the question that had haunted the case returned to the courtroom. Was Alex Ewing the man who had entered the Bennett home? The prosecution said yes. The DNA evidence, they argued, connected him to the crime. The defense argued otherwise, but the jury had heard the evidence. They had seen the case reconstructed. They had been asked to look backward through nearly 4 decades of time. And then came the moment the Bennett family had waited for. The verdict: guilty. After 37 years, the case was no longer officially unsolved. The killer had been identified. The jury had spoken, and Ewing was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. But for the Bennett family, the verdict could never be the end of the story. Because a conviction can answer one question. It cannot answer all of them. It cannot explain what Bruce thought in his final moments. It cannot explain what Debra felt when she realized her family was in danger. It cannot tell Melissa what her 8th birthday might have been like. And it cannot give Vanessa back the childhood that was taken from her before she was old enough to understand what she had lost. The courtroom could deliver justice, but it could not turn back time. And as the case finally closed, one question remained. What does justice look like when it arrives 37 years too late? For most people, the Bennett case is remembered as a triple murder. 3 victims, 1 killer, 1 cold case. But there was another person inside that house, a 3-year-old girl, Vanessa. She survived. And that fact changes the entire emotional weight of the story. Because Vanessa did not simply lose her family. She lost them before she was old enough to understand the full meaning of the word family. She grew up with an absence, a silence. Questions that could never be answered in the ordinary way. There would be photographs, stories from relatives, memories belonging to other people. People saying, "Your mother was like this. Your father loved this. Your sister used to do that." But the people themselves were gone, and the person responsible had remained unidentified for decades. Every year that passed without an arrest was another year in which the mystery remained alive. The killer had a future. Vanessa had to grow up with the past. And somewhere in the middle of those 2 realities was the evidence. The DNA, the case file, the photographs, the memories, all waiting for the day when science would finally connect them. That day came in 2018. But by then, 34 years had passed since the murders. And by the time Ewing was convicted in 2021, 37 years had passed. A child had become an adult. A cold case had become a courtroom trial. And a family that had once gathered to celebrate a birthday had become the subject of one of Colorado's most haunting murder investigations. But the final question is not simply who killed the Bennett family. The final question is this: after all those years, what should the world remember about the people who were lost? Before Bruce Bennett became a name in a murder investigation, he was a person. A husband, a father, a man who had served his country, a man who had come home to his family. Before Debra became part of a cold case, she was a young woman with a life that had not yet reached its full story. A wife, a mother, a daughter, someone whose future was stolen. And before Melissa became the 7-year-old victim in a triple homicide, she was simply a little girl waiting for her 8th birthday. She had a family. She had a home. She had a life that should have continued. And Vanessa was not merely the survivor discovered inside a crime scene. She was a child who should have grown up with her parents. A child who should have watched her sister turn 8. A child who should have had ordinary memories of birthdays, family dinners, holidays, and growing up. Instead, she survived a night that destroyed everything around her. For 37 years, the Bennett family waited for an answer. And eventually, that answer came through something so small that it could barely be seen. DNA. A microscopic trace. A piece of evidence that survived when memories faded. When investigators retired. When decades passed. When the world moved on. The evidence remained. And eventually, it pointed to a name. Alex Ewing. The killer was identified. The jury delivered its verdict. The sentence was handed down. But the most important names in this story are not the name of the killer. They are the names of the people whose lives were taken. Bruce, Debra, Melissa, and Vanessa. Because the Bennett family was not born as a cold case. They were not born as a headline. They were not born as victims. They were a family. They loved. They laughed. They gathered together. They celebrated a little girl's birthday. And then, in one night, everything changed. But the killer did not get the final word. For 37 years he had silence. The Bennett family had the truth. And eventually, the truth found him. Because time can bury evidence. It can bury memories. It can bury names. It can bury names. But sometimes, one small trace remains, waiting. Waiting for science to catch up. Waiting for someone to look again. Waiting for the truth to come home. And in the end, the Bennett family was remembered. Not because of how they died, but because they lived. Bruce, Debra, Melissa. Their names are still here. And after 37 years of silence, that may be the most important thing of all.